want to know more about renewal. I know that it's going to be something that will be beneficial to us as all of these topics are. Matt is going to lead us in a word of prayer, and then we'll hear from somebody.
We have to Father, we thank you for this opportunity and more will we come together to learn about your word. So thankful for Jamela tonight that we come to bring us the word tonight and that we might learn much from it. Heavenly Father, we pray that you be with those in our lives too. Couldn't make it clear tonight. Heavenly Father, we would each and every one of us in those situations. Heavenly Father, we pray that you just be with us and forgive us of our sins. We pray these things in Christ's name.
Okay, I'd like to think I turned this on properly. Okay. All right, so our topic for tonight will be renewal. Right off the bat, one of the things I gotta do, renew my way of speaking, since I have a naturally lower voice and tend to not take note of that. So that's one thing I'm gonna have to already be applying my lesson tonight, right? Now, one thing I usually like to do when I get topics, if it's a word like this, I like to kind of deconstruct the word, pick it apart a little bit. So renewal comes from renew. I'm not going to give the definition, renew. So two words come together, re and new. The re, again, and new, as opposed to being old. Reason why I like doing that, it helps a lot when you deal with other things, if you kind of get to thinking that way. And it really did help a lot with the lesson. Now, when we talk about renewal or renewing something, we're talking about the status or quality of that thing. And as applied to our spirituality, I could only think of the mind, and looking at the lesson itself, it would lead towards baptism, but I didn't want to make, baptism is a big part of renewal. If you're not a Christian, we'll get to if you're a Christian, but I didn't want to make the whole lesson about baptism, right? I mean, it's not like we don't need to hear more about baptism. So the lesson text, if you would like to open there, Titus 3, verses 1 through 5. I will read that. And by the way, if you do have any comments, questions, feel free to just stop me at any point. Titus 3, verses 1 through 5. Put them in mind to be subject to principalities and powers, to obey magistrates, to be ready to every good work, to speak evil of no man, to be no brawlers, but gentle, showing all meekness unto all men. For we ourselves also were sometimes foolish, disobedient, deceived, serving divers lusts and pleasures, living in malice and envy, hateful, and hating one another. But after that, the kindness and love of God our Savior toward men appeared, not by works of righteousness which we have done, but according to his mercy he saved us by the washing of regeneration and renewing of the Holy Ghost. Initially, I'd chosen that verse 5, but I figure the whole of that makes a lot more sense. Verse 1 speaks of mind. A lot of the faith, a lot to do with Christianity, always begins with the mind. It always starts with the mind. And it's almost as if, we've been brought up a certain way, and then God comes in and seeks to change our minds. And in looking at this topic and speaking about that renewal, if we consider ourselves and God in this text, we have a relationship with God. And that is where I wanted to put our focus, that relationship between ourselves and God. And that is where we will be applying that renewal. And I particularly like this thought because it applies equally to both the Christian and the one who's not a Christian. How so, you may ask? The person who's not a Christian also has a relationship to God. And the only difference between that person and the Christian, the one who's a Christian, is that the relationship is either in a good state or bad state. But that can also be applied to the Christian, right? We can also be in a bad state of relationship with God. So that is why I wanted us to focus on that. It applies equally to everybody. So in pulling out that implication, even if I'm in denial about God and everything, there still is that relationship. And until there's that point of renewal, which obviously will go on up there, then that relationship will remain in one of those states. And a verse we're going to be looking at a lot tonight is Ecclesiastes 7:29. Lo, this only have I found, that God hath made man upright, but they have sought out many inventions. Does anybody have perhaps an ESV? I would like to get that in another, because I have some side notes here. If it has different wording in there. Yes, yes. Okay. So in taking that, kind of put the lesson in a way of, there's a starting point, and then obviously we go to the finishing point. And I put this in the form of man's development, from being a baby, teenager, and the rest of the life of a person. So in application with that verse, when God first makes man, the relationship is in a good state. I also wanted to use if you're familiar with the game, red light, green light. Green, then you got red, then you got green. So the relationship, we can say, is green. We can even, all the way from where this thing begins, from the Garden of Eden, when we find Adam and Eve, we can see that transition of that relationship between God and man. But what does this mean to anybody listening to this? If there's a relationship, there's a responsibility on both parties. And I think we can all agree that God has already taken care of his part of that relationship. So a lot of this is going to be, as I've been mentioning, the mind, the way we think of our relationship with God and perhaps with other Christians. So God bestowed many things upon us. And in that same vein, I just thought, just being a human being comes with a lot of blessings, does it not? Are there any things we can think just by virtue of we're human beings? Is there anything we can think of that is a blessing? I can throw one out as an example: marriage. Thank you. There we go. There we go. Which is enjoyed by all. Yes. So, oh yes, the Bible is a big part of that. Excuse me. Maybe that's one I shouldn't skip over. If we just think of, there is a whole plan of salvation just for mankind. Angels don't get into that, and some people have entertained maybe the devil could be saved. No, he's not a human being. There's a whole plan of salvation just for mankind. So just by virtue of us being human beings already bestows upon us a lot of blessings from God. So, when first we are created into this world as being those children, I think we can all agree, when we look into the faces of children, a lot of people see that innocence, you know. And it is by that same thought that if somebody oppresses a child, people in that community are going to do something about it, right? Because of that innocence. So that very same innocence, that is the first part of our relationship with God. When we first come into the world, we have that innocence upon us, bestowed by God. In fact, Matthew 18, verse 3, if somebody would get that, please. Jesus uses this very thing, this very trait of children, to say that we should be converted and be as little children. All right, Matthew 18, verse 3, and said, Verily I say unto you, except ye be converted. I don't know if anybody's version uses a different word than converted, and become as little children, ye shall not enter into the kingdom of heaven. And again, there is that word converted, again, applying to the mind. So there has to be a change in the thinking. There has to be a renewal of that thinking. And this is something that Jesus is saying to his followers. Except there is a change in the way you think from what you're thinking currently, or your way of thinking right now, you shall not be able to enter into heaven. So there has to be a change in our way of thinking to have that same kind of trust in God. But looking at that state of a child, or that state we were in, I think a lot of us, when our parents taught us to pray to God and everything about God, you know, we pretty much believed it, didn't we? We just took it to heart, and until we started having our own opinions, right? It is at that state where we show that complete trust in God. And maybe the question I had there, what is the first thing that a child does when somebody oppresses that child, or when they have a difficult situation? Yes. And that is to what? Signal the parents, I need your help, right? And what would that mean? What would that do for the Christian if we had that kind of thinking about God? And maybe the same question can go to the non-Christian. Who is it that the non-Christian turns to when such situations present themselves in life? The person I thought of here was Job. Job chapter 1, verses 9 through 11. So in this text, Satan and the sons of God are presenting themselves before God. And what is interesting, Satan is there. He wants to accuse Job, right? God presents Job to him. He is there to make accusations. It is pretty much the same thing for humanity nowadays. 1 Peter 5:8. How does it come across if when we think that at the end of our lives, or even now, there's somebody waiting around every corner to make an accusation? Did you see what he did? Did you see what he did? And what does that innocence do for us in those cases? And that's the example I have about Job here. That exchange between God and Job. So let me read from verses 8 through 11. And the Lord said unto Satan, Hast thou considered my servant Job, that there is none like him in the earth, a perfect and upright man, one that feareth God and escheweth evil? Then Satan answered the Lord and said, Doth Job fear God for naught? Hast not thou made an hedge about him, and about his house, and about all that he hath on every side? That thou hast blessed the work of his hands, and his substance is increased in the land. But put forth thine hand now, and touch all that he hath, and it will curse thee to thy face. Now, this is presented from the other side, right? Job is not aware of all these things, but we certainly can see that these things are true in the life of Job, which also makes his reactions quite interesting when things happen to him. Now, contrast that with somebody who does not have that kind of trust in God. And consider if they did not have that state of relationship with God, what God would do in that situation. It is often the case as well that people wait until it's often almost too late to try and turn to God, to call out to God, when the relationship is not yet in a proper state. Now, after this stage, we come to the stage of teenagehood. I could only think of that stage because that's where a lot of people start to exercise their free will, right? We start to know a lot of things. We start to have ideas about things. We want to do so many things with our lives, right? We have so much ambition with our lives. And again, I would like for us to go back to that Ecclesiastes 7:29. God made man upright. God made man in a proper relationship with him, but he has learned many inventions. Do our ambitions tend to pull us away from God? They make us disregard our relationship with God. And remember that thing I said, that even from childhood, everybody has a proper relationship with God, but life keeps pulling them away. We do not look at a child, we look at the parents, right? What happened with this child? And often it's quite the contrast when you see somebody who was a wee sweet child and has turned into this. I don't know what kind of description to give, but I think you get the idea of what I'm trying to say, right? But again, this is where we begin to have a lot of responsibilities, is it not? The more blessings we have, the more responsibilities they come with. Just by God put the earth under dominion of man, but he put a responsibility with that, right? You are to take care of these things. So the more blessings we get, the more responsibilities. But I think often the case is that for a lot of people, we want the benefits without the responsibility, right? We exercise our free will to the point where everything else we set to the side, but I want, what does the world say? The world is your, I don't want to use the wrong word, oyster, there we go. Now, I don't know why it became an oyster. I have no wish to eat that kind of thing. I don't know if anybody has tried that. So I don't know how that got there. But so it's a whole, I want my piece of the cake, my piece of the pie. Everything else, do not show me, do not tell me anything else. So it's usually at the stage when that relationship does become in the red, the teenagehood stage. Now again, I'll refer to that relationship in the Garden of Eden between Adam and Eve and God. We can see that same transition. And then we can also refer to such books as Numbers and Judges. We see that cycle again and again. And what's interesting in Judges, it comes right, it goes red, it goes green, red, green, green. And we see it's always that same thing being pulled away by ambition and all those other things. And as somebody mentioned earlier, what God has done in giving us the Bible is to open our minds to those things that have now become neglected, those responsibilities we have which have now become neglected, which we have ignored. And I think the most incredible thing that God does is He seeks to have us, there are consequences to not taking care of those responsibilities. But God seeks to have us avoid some of those consequences. You can think of your Hebrews 9:27, judgment, there is a judgment that will be coming. God seeks to have us avoid that consequence of what would happen if we are not fulfilling what we should be fulfilling. Now, the example I could think of here was of family relationships. I think that's a good way to think about it. If a parent and children are neglecting their relationships, the relationship between parent and children, there's definitely going to be some problems, right? Just because it's a father and son, father and daughter, mother and daughter, it does not, it's not an automatic thing that takes care of itself, right? There are responsibilities on both sides of that relationship. So we mentioned some things. Usually it's such things as prosperity, fame, but I think what has become the most distracting thing for people today is, as it's so succinctly put, find myself. I am going to find myself. Somebody asked me to buy a book not too long ago, and the title is pretty much that, seeking yourself and all. So I kind of made a joke about it. Did you lose yourself somewhere along the way? But these are things that the Bible has already answered for us, are they not? We already have all the groundwork laid out for us. I think the biggest accusation maybe which I've heard to date against God is that He's a tyrant. He does not care about humanity. Basically, it's a one-way relationship, right? He tells us what to do and we do it. But if we look at a few things in the Bible, we see that God, the things He would have us do, the things He commands for us, are for our own benefit, right? We can think of this as setting boundaries. Without boundaries, there can only be anarchy, right? Some examples of this: John 15:12, to love one another. I've heard that song again and again on TV, love, 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 but you just never see it, right? 1 Peter 4:9, hospitality. I tend to think of back in the day, but that's not a good way to think either, right? You would see a lot of that. Galatians 6:2, bear ye one another's burdens. I think we do good on that here, right? That's something we do a good job of. And then 1 Corinthians 10:24, let no man seek his own, but to seek, let me read it. I'm going to butcher it right now. Give me 1 Corinthians 10:24. Let no man seek his own, but every man another's. Now mine says wealth, and I have a side note that says well-being. So we seek the well-being of others. I mean, we could find more examples of those types of things in the Bible. Those things that God would have people who are Christians do, or people who have a proper relationship with Him, which incidentally makes people to have a better relationship with one another as well, right? We find those things which are beneficial to society as a whole. And it always begs the question, Why do people reject it so much? If anybody wants to answer that question, you're welcome. Why do people reject the idea of worshiping God, of becoming a Christian, fellowshipping with other Christians? That is very true. In case in point, and this happened years ago. I don't know. I think I might have given this example before. I was speaking to a young girl, saying, "Hey, you need to come worship with us," and she straight out said, when you become a Christian, your life becomes a lot much difficult. Well, I don't know what you're talking about, but it's a true statement, right? But the only difficulty is in, and I'm not kind of putting that aside. Usually the difficulty is in, there's that renewal point. There's a change of the mind, a change of the way of living, a change of the way of interacting with other people. There are all these changes, which often a lot of people are going to stand back and like, well, okay. It kind of makes you stand out, doesn't it? It makes you stand out. That's interesting. I wonder why. A lot of that probably has to do with the way people believe and where they go to worship. One I've heard from a preacher who said he converted somebody he was speaking to was it a Baptist? And after he converted him, he said, aren't you happy not to have to be tithing anymore? Yeah. So, I'm not going to open a can of worms with that. I'll just leave it at that. But with where that person was worshiping, it was, you do it or else. So there are those kinds of things which you can find in religion, which would make people think twice. But usually it's because they've not heard the proper truth, correct? All right, now moving on from that one. Now, usually when we get on that path of, I want what's mine, we might even actually be successful to some extent. But then what happens when life's billows blow, when things start to come down around us? That's why often you find people become bitter about life because we try to do it all by ourselves. I think maybe one, I'll call it a truth, is really there is no one human being who can go through life by themselves. And often some thoughts may be just our family against the world. I don't think that works very well either, So there needs to be some kind of relationship with a higher power. But at the same time, it is at this very stage where we'll be able to first come to that realization of the status of our relationship with God. And what's interesting about that is this bit that I have to take that first step. I mean, God has already taken a step about it to renew that relationship. So now it's up to me to take that step. let us move on to the last stage of human development. I was putting ages to this. I kind of thought 30 years and onwards was the last stage, because there's no turning back, from that point. And it's usually when people hit that age, people start to stop and for a minute and take a look behind, like, where have I been? What have I been doing with my life? It's at that stage that people start to really think about their lives. Now, for some people, it might be earlier, but I think usually when you hit 30, you start to have a little look behind the shoulder to see where you've been and what everything has become. And it's at that point where you can be able to take note of the status of our relationship with God. And it's at this point where we can make it green again. And for some people, maybe it might remain red, because, again, it has to come from the individual. Now, again, this happens both to one who might already be a Christian at that point and one who's not a Christian. And for the Christian, I will say this, and maybe this is more from a personal experience than anything. So, because I grew up in the church, I think for many people like that, there's a huge danger in just kind of going along with the flow, because you think, well, I've done what's needed, so there we are. So there's a danger of being lethargic, which also makes it important at that point for that person to also take note of that status of the relationship with God. I think at this point it's good then to talk about baptism, kind of start wrapping up as well. For one who's not a Christian, the process must at some point involve baptism. Excuse me. Why baptism? Well, it's not just the fact of dipping in the water. It's because that's what God has prescribed to fix that relationship, right? To renew the status of the relationship. That's what God would have you do. And maybe to further this example, I thought, what does a married couple do when there's a problem? So somebody has to do something, right? You have to do what's necessary to fix that relationship. The same thing happens, parents and children. If you have a workmate and there's been some kind of offense, the necessary steps have to be followed. And the relationship becomes green because the proper steps have been followed. And then you can have your 2 Corinthians 5:17, you've now become a new creature. Everything else is forgotten. And what I found most amazing about this as well, people get into a lot of things, but God is able to take that very broken relationship, throw it away behind him, Micah 7:19, and new creature. All things are become new. I thought that was a very interesting thing. And maybe along with that, just the very fact that the God of heaven wants to have a relationship with us. I mean, if we really think about who God is, what he's capable of, and he wants to have a relationship with each one of us. I think that's quite an incredible thing, to the point he's taken that first step to give his son so that we can take the necessary steps as well. So there needs to be that recognizing that there is a problem, and then the necessary steps need to be taken. But not only for the non-Christian, even the Christian, 1 John 2, verses 1 through 6, has a process for that as well. Talk about the love of God. So renewal is a process, and I would say it starts in the mind. We have to change our way of thinking, our conduct, and in presenting this lesson, I wanted us to think differently of God, and perhaps it's that innocence which I started talking about that quite gets me. When you get to the stage, you renew your relationship with God. Again, we're talking about renew, so you're going back to the way that relationship was. Satan cannot make any accusations against you which will stand. I think that's quite significant. And that should make us more confident in our Christianity and in what God has done for us. And we don't need to wait till our 30s to begin this renewal process. Any comments or questions? I am stopping at 7:40, right? Otherwise I ended pretty early. Right? I usually save the last few minutes for comments, questions, but if there are none, thank you for your attention.